Okay, for this year's Ecology and Entomology section AGM talk, I'm really pleased to welcome Dr. Tony Madgwick, who is the LNHS recorder for bees and wasps, and he's going to provide us with his notes on being an LNHS recorder. So over to you, Tony. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Kieran, and thank you everybody for for the committee for letting me talk about one of my favourite topics, and also for everybody for turning up to listen. When I gave the title, I thought I was being very clever, and in retrospect, I think perhaps that wasn't the case. Since I've given myself such a wide subject area to talk about, it's quite difficult to narrow it down to something that's kind of deliverable. But we'll see how it goes. I suppose the most important thing is, for many of you who don't know who I am or what I do, I'm going to point out what I do as recorder for the LNHS. So essentially, I suppose my favourite thing to be doing is to be out looking for bees and wasps out in the field. And field work is really where all of this starts, and to some extent finishes as well. So we're out there looking for bees and wasps, making record, making IDs, and importantly also getting other people involved and engaged with looking at bees and wasps in our urban and semi-urban environments. That's a really important thing for us to do out of our kind of brief. I spent a bit of time in my home lab as well as the lab. Well, I was working in the lab at the university as well. And although I'm often looking at bees and wasps, I also extend my tentacles into flies as well, and one or two other groups. Then, of course, I also have an interest in trying to get photographs of a lot of these insects, particularly photographs good enough to make good, firm identification from. And so that's a kind of sideline which I enjoy doing, but it's also useful for illustrative purposes. And of course, as we'll see a little bit later on, it's really important when it comes to you guys actually generating good images, which we as verifiers can actually work with in order to establish whether or not you've seen what you think you've seen, and also to help you to identify what it is. And then I entertain a lot of people by doing a little bit of bee and wasp wrangling as well, to hold them, to get them up close and personal with those people I'm actually helping or being with. That's all great fun, really. A mixed audience. So I have to assume that some of you, most of you, I should think, know the difference between a bee, a wasp, and a fly. But it is one of the most common questions that I get asked out in the field. And it's the one that's sometimes I actually kind of think, so used to describing and talking about bees, I forget to actually discriminate between them. This little table kind of summarizes some of the important differences. So we have a bee, a wasp, and a fly, and ostensibly they look very different. They can also look very similar depending on the species. There's a kind of continuum between them. So in terms of body shapes, you usually get these sort of round, furry shapes with bees. You get a slightly more slender look, often with a conspicuous waist and a lack of hairs with wasps. And with flies, generally they tend to be bare in their bodies, but often quite bristly as well. Of course, the other distinction, which is not always easy to see, is the number of wings. So wasps in bees have 4 wings, whereas flies will only have 2 wings. Again, some of the wasps will actually fold their wings up and fold them onto their backs, so it becomes quite difficult, particularly with the smaller wasps, to separate them out from flies. And very often when I'm out in the field with those people who haven't really had much experience looking at bees and wasps, the assumption is always anything that's small and black is a fly. And very often it turns out that they're actually small bees or small wasps, or some of the chalcids, some of the other smaller insects as well, fly being an all-encompassing term that most things that fly and are small get labeled with. But I suppose just coming back onto the most important thing, with bees, bees tend to carry pollen. That's their main forage component, which they'll take back to their nest sites. Or whereas wasps will be taking prey or carrion, so they're meat eaters, feeding their grubs that kind of food, whereas flies won't be carrying anything at all. And so the adaptations for these different types of behaviors, whether it's pollen carrying and hairiness, prey carrying with large jaws and powerful legs, or just simply having a large proboscis to either stab things with your predator or to suck things up if you're not, in the case of flies. So looking up close and personal is often a good thing to do with anything that's flying, to see which group it falls into. And I hasten to say they're all equally interesting. No one is better than the other. The elephant in the room, I suppose, in a talk like this is, well, what about the common honeybee, the Western honeybee, Apis mellifera? very, very frequently recorded, and it's one that I've come across quite a lot. We see it a lot actually being entered into iRecord and into iNaturalist. And there's often that question, here we have a farmed animal, a feral animal, if you like, in some cases. Is it actually worthy of being recorded? And I think the answer, as we'll see a little bit later on, is yes, it is. It's good to see where these bees are, and it's good to see what they're doing and whether or not we can get a feel for whether there's an overconcentration or otherwise in particular areas. And one of the things that as a recorder I'm hoping to do, and I hope some of that we've talked about the butterfly atlas, for example, is by generating atlases, we can look at overlaps between different bee species and also the forage that they're using to keep themselves going in particular areas. So as we'll see a little bit later on, it's important to also include the honeybee in that recording scheme. Of course, one of the important things about honeybees is they've got these nice hairy eyes, these round torpedo-shaped bodies, and these large cubiculate legs with usually carrying a large lump of pollen on the hind legs. They're very clearly distinctively different, although they do show different color morphs, which can often cause a little bit of confusion. But generally speaking, once people have worked out what a honeybee looks like, they get it right every time. Of course, on the good things about having lots of honeybees, and I know there are a couple of beekeepers in the audience, is we've also seen expansion in the bee wolf, Philanthus triangulum, which for me is one of my favorite wasps. There's just something about, I know this is supposed to be a bee talk, but I have to talk about wasps at some point. But you have to see that these bees sit on flowers on forage areas, waiting for bees to come by, which they're going to ambush. They're going to grab them, sting them, paralyze them, take them back to the nest to feed their grubs. But the way they look when they're sitting in the flowers, this kind of alert, intelligent look they have is quite almost unique amongst most of the wasps and bees. They're very dear to my heart. Back in the 80s, when I was youngish, these were rare. I had to go to Minsmere Bird Reserve to go and see them. In the last few years, their numbers have exploded, and we see them all over London, have very wide distribution, and in quite large aggregates, nest aggregates as well. This is not having a major impact on honeybee populations, beekeepers, but nonetheless, it's fascinating to watch their interactions with the places where people are. And again, the theme that's going to emerge, I hope, from what I'm talking about, is this interaction between anthropogenic habitats, areas where people have been, and how important they are to actually promote the survival of many of these newly colonizing species as well as well-established species as well. So if you're ever around, I think there's one area we have in Wanstead Flats, for example, where people are sitting at tables surrounded by very heavily poached ground with hundreds of bee walls flying in and out amongst them, totally unaware of the presence of these super wasps. And they're not, as you can see from the picture over here, they're bigger than a honeybee in terms of length. So they're not exactly easily ignored, and yet people don't seem to notice them. They're certainly not frightened of them, which is excellent. So in terms of recording and what we see recorded, yes, the most frequently recorded bees in iRecord in particular tend to be the large bombus species, the bumblebees. And of those, Bombus lapidarius, the red-tailed bumblebee, and Bombus terrestris, stroke recorum, usually terrestris, are also the most frequently recorded, along with Bombus biscorum, the common carder bee. Interestingly, Bombus hypnorum, or the tree bumblebee, wasn't until recently seen to be increasing in numbers, but seems to have decreased. And certainly there are fewer records, and anecdotally, and this is one of the problems we have with recording bees, there's a lot of anecdote flying around and very little hard evidence, and coming on to that in a moment. But the tree bumblebee seems to be declining again. Now, whether it's going through a boom-bust cycle or not, we don't know at the moment. It'd be interesting to see what's actually happening. But certainly, I've had hundreds of tree bumblebees in my garden up until the last couple of years, and then suddenly they've just disappeared. And I don't see them nearly as often as I used to. And that's reflected in the records coming into iRecord as well. So something worth following up and having a look at, which is why recording is so important, and why everybody submitting their records, even of relatively common species, is an important thing to do. Apart from the bumblebees, which are relatively easy, well, I say easy, in broad terms, are easy to identify and recognize. We have more than 275 different wild bees in the UK. Quite a few of them actually appear in London. And interestingly, particularly for London, the Thames Gateway, we're actually seeing an increasing number of new colonizers begin to appear along the Thames Gateway. So new species are arriving. And just to make matters a little bit more complicated, of course, we are beginning to split some species as well as we start to move into molecular methods for splitting species. So what the actual number is at the moment, I did mean to sit down to work it up. We're certainly pushing the 280 plus in terms of species in the UK. And they come in a wide variety of forms. So we have the well-established bees like Colitis davisanus. We also have lots of the smaller bees like the Lacea glossums. These are actually often recorded. They are really hard to separate out in the field. So we tend to see fewer genera being recorded from year to year, although they tend to work their way through the system as people take specimens or take photographs and actually work out what they're looking at. Others like Panurgus, the shaggy mining bees, which are gorgeous little creatures, often found asleep in flowers. It's a great way of finding them. We have two species in the UK, Panurgus calcaratus and Panurgus banksianus. And both of those are found, for example, in East London. We can find those curled up in flowers. And so we have an interest with recording, actually go in there and give them a little bit of a prod so they can raise their antennae. And we know that one will have an orange antenna, the other will have a black antenna. And there's a slight difference in size as well. Good way of telling them apart, getting up close and personal with our bees. And one of my favorites, rarer bee in the London area is Macropis europea, or the yellow loosestrife bee. And that's beginning to crop up in little places here and there. And again, because of the relative lack of yellow loosestrife growing in large amounts by water with appropriate banks for nesting, there are rather restricted areas where we find this bee, and it'd be fun to actually try and improve habitats to actually encourage these bees to expand their ranges and give pleasure to so many people, because these bees often fly along ditches, the size of ditches and banks. They're very characterful in the way they fly. When they land to go into the flowers, they stick their legs out to the back, and then they're they are bothered by the other males. The females are gathering oils and nectar and pollen for the larvae. But they actually show a lot of interesting behavior which can captivate particularly children when they're watching them. So they're a really interesting bee to watch. So lots of bees to look at, lots of different bees, difficult to discriminate between them at all times. So why should we be interested in bees, apart from the fact that they are inherently fascinating anyway? And as a kind of aside, this is a tray. This is Alfred Russel Wallace's collection taken from his travels. And here we have Megachaia Pluto, which was first discovered by Wallace in 1858. Never found again until 1981, and still not really understood. So there are plenty of bees in far off tropical climes and difficult to access places that are really poorly understood. And to some extent, that's true of some of our own bees. We don't understand everything that all bees do. So there's plenty to be done in terms of behavioral studies and looking at their interactions with the environment around them. In fact, quite recently, there was an interesting paper that's just been published suggesting that the size of a bee's brain will actually influence its ability to adapt to anthropogenic change. So we find big-brained bees in urban environments and smaller-brained bees in more rural environments. I think there's some critical evaluation of this paper to be had, but it's an interesting allometric relationship between big bees with big brains versus smaller bees and smaller brains. We can discuss that later if you wish to do so. But of course, the most important thing about bees is their role as pollinators. And of course, then that links into looking at biodiversity and habitat quality, because between the two areas, all these overall concepts of habitat, biodiversity, and role in pollination and promoting the effectiveness of ecosystems and assemblages of plants and animals. The presence of pollinators is one of those fundamental keystone elements within any natural assemblage. So it's worth actually looking to see at the relationships that bees have elsewhere. They are relatively easy to monitor and look at, and also easy to get citizen scientists involved and engaged with, compared with, say, looking at aphids, or I think Tristan's in the background, bugs as well, things that probably aren't quite so amenable to the, oh, that's cute kind of factor. certainly in terms of looking at habitat quality, by looking at the types of bees, the range of bees that are present, we can actually begin to understand some of the opportunities and threats that we see in our very hard-pressed urban green spaces. And those urban green spaces are now increasingly under threat from development and other eco-friendly type interventions, which may not be quite what they seem. So certainly this is really important to actually assess and record what types of bees are present in a given environment. And I put in not in, sort of just to reduce the kind of emphasis. There's also the green space experience that is associated with being engaged with bees. I do find that when I'm running some of the bee walks, many people do become very, very engaged with the environment around them, more so perhaps than they would otherwise be. And the bees tend to be a gateway to that experience. Not so much the wasps, unfortunately, but certainly the bees are very much a gateway organism. And the other thing to bear in mind about bees in urban environments is, of course, is their pollination, their efficiency compared with, say, perhaps either honeybees and also perhaps to a lesser extent the bombus bees as well, the bumblebees. So most of our wild bees, our solitary bees, tend to be dry pollinators. They carry large amounts of pollen on hairs, either in hairs adapted on their hind legs and part of their abdomens, or the scopus of the abdomen, for example, in Herodes truncorum. These are fantastic little bees. You often see them scurrying over ragwort, waggling their abdomens and gathering pollen in their scopa, very similar to some of the megachires as well. But this pollen is impacted into the hairs of the scopa or of the flocculi of the bees, but they shed a lot of pollen as well. So they go from flower to flower, they're actually shedding and transferring a lot of pollen around. So being very efficient pollinators, maybe not so efficient as foragers, or they don't lose that much, which contrasts with the honeybees, which tend to stick the pollen together with a bit of nectar and then clean off most of the pollen from their bodies as they fly from flower to flower, and are not spreading quite so much pollen as they go. Very efficient at foraging, possibly less so in terms of pollination. We need a lot more bees to pollinate the same amount of flowers as we would with most solitary bees. So of course that comes on to this idea of habitat management and how we look at our habitats around us, whether it's your gardens or whether it's local nature reserves or roadsides and so on. And Ollerton put in this triangle, which kind of works, but it's a good way of trying to explain the relationship between flowers on the one hand, and the fact that flowers need to be present throughout the breeding season of any given bee, and that could be spring, it could be summer, it could be from the beginning of spring to the middle of summer, and so on. So there needs to be that sort of floral succession, allowing the adequate supply of the pollens required by the bees to feed their young, and the nectar that's required to sustain energy for gathering pollen. And of course, depending on the length of the tongue, that will influence the type of flower that's most preferred. So most colites, like things like daisies and ragworts, where they can just have very short tongues to suck up nectar, whereas bumblebees can cope with the long-faced bumblebees can cope with much deeper flowers and get down to the nectar is there. In terms of reproduction, we have a similar relationship between the type of host plants, providing the right kind of pollen for a particular species, and also whether they have the right nesting sites. And we'll talk about those briefly in a moment. And then, of course, various supplements. So although pollen is required for reproduction, we need nectar, etc., for energy, to actually driving bee energetics. And we also need the appropriate nesting materials, which will be part of the manipulation and development of nest sites. And also we need appropriate hibernation sites, particularly for those social bees, which may be overwintering, whereas most of our solitary bees will actually be in specific nests, either underground or in aerial nesting cavities. So all of those elements, those three elements, need to come together in a well-managed habitat or appropriately managed habitat that will support a good floral mix with good habitat for nesting and hibernation. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but just to make sure you're aware of the fact we have our ground nesters. Majority of our British bees, well, a small majority, tend to be ground nesters. And they're often the most obvious ones that we see, particularly where they form large aggregates. You can see large sort of spoil from a number of bees burrowing into this bank. Here we see Colites hederi, the ivy bee, burrowing again into it's a very short bank. It's only a few centimeters in height. It's basically a small drainage ditch with sufficient sandy material for it to actually burrow into. And these burrows may go up to a meter deep into the ground with galleries off into which the bees will be laying eggs and packing pollen, creating cells for developing the larva. Then we have things like Andrina clarkella, which are also being found in sandy soil. And these can also form really quite large aggregates of bees. Other mining bees tend to be a little bit more sneaky and hide away, so you don't find them quite so easily. And they'll nest in kind of on their own, maybe within a few meters of each other, and are much more difficult to track down. We can often see them flying low over the ground as they find their way to specific nest sites. And of course, we have bees in London, particularly like Osmia spinulosa, that will actually use snail shells as its nest site. So I've counted them as a ground nester because they're kind of ground nesters. Most snails are on the ground when they die. Then we have the aerial nesters, mixed up into or divided into excavators and renters, and they use a wide variety of environments. And most our favourites, I suppose, and many of you will probably have stood by a dead standing tree and looked and watched at the many bees and wasps that'll be going backwards and forwards. These immense kind of multi-story tower blocks of living quarters for a wide variety of insects, particularly bees. They'll be using the exit holes or the galleries, mining galleries of beetle larvae, for example, and these are the renters. Others will actually be excavating and digging out new cracks and crevices in the wood to create new galleries or open up galleries to be made by other insects to create nest sites. But along with that, we also have various deadwood in particular is probably more important for wasps rather than bees. That's deadwood lying on the ground. In fact, this particular tree, which is in Wanstead Park, fell over this year. It was blown over. And it was interesting that the large numbers of bees that were nesting in this site, once it fell over, seemed to have left, leaving it mostly to the smaller wasps. So it's an interesting change because of the way it's now more shaded. It's not as warm as it used to be. It's now not so popular with the bees that were using it before. Then we have things like brambles and grass stalks. Both of these can be used by bees and wasps as nest sites, and in particular brambles. Brambles are so poorly treated by so many, and we see this quite a lot. Let's go and thrash away the brambles. Let's clear large amounts of it. And yet the pithy stems of brambles are fantastic nest sites for a variety of different bees, particularly Keratina cyanea, which is the small blue carpenter bee, which can be completely wiped out if you're not careful. You won't not notice the fact these bees are tiny, about 4 millimeters long. They fly very low on the ground, easily overlooked, and nest, as I say, in bramble stems. And those are often the bits of brambles, dead brambles, that are hacked back and thrown away or burned. So if you do cutting down brambles, pile them up somewhere just in case you've got some unnoticed bees there, or check with some, get someone like us to come along and have a look. So here's an example of a renter. This is Hylaeus communis, which is one of the yellow-faced bees. And you can just about see, hopefully on your screen, some of you may have quite small screens, it may be difficult to see, but you can also see the nest entrances over here. And this bee has just come out. It's just about to go off and look for another female to mate with. Then over here we have one of the excavators, in this case a megachyle. And again, he's or she has actually excavated enlarged an exit hole from one of the beetles, and you can see there are lots and lots of other holes. All of these may be potentially used by bees and wasps, and it's always worth having a look at trees at this time of year just to see how many of these holes are actually filled, where you can actually see where the nest entrances are being blocked up to protect the larvae within. Of course, we can utilize this tendency to use aerial nesting renting accommodation by creating artificial nest sites. We can use bee boxes, bee hotels, and trap nests. And you can see here we've got bees of different types. We've got Herodes truncorum in this case. And here we've got one of the megachiles with the leafcutter bees with a sealed cell group there. And with Herodes, for example, you'll see this impacted concrete which protects the insects within. I have to say, in my experience, this is not always successful. Sometimes some of the wasps can actually penetrate through this apparently impenetrable barrier. And also birds, particularly blue tits, for the smaller nest sites, and with the megachiles, woodpeckers will actually take some of the outer larvae and pupae by predation. But interesting, these are mostly males who will be at the far end. So male predation is actually quite high, but usually a few males survive, and the females beyond that, because the female eggs are laid first, then the male eggs as work through the tube. They will then survive to go out and breed. So males in that sense seem to be quite expendable to save the species. I'll just quickly drop over that. So nest site selection, this is really an excuse to show pretty pictures of bees because I like doing that. This is Andrena natida, one of the lovely mining bees. Most of the nest sites require a nice south-southeast facing site, which contrasts a little bit with wasps that often prefer more sheltered areas, more hidden areas, and cooler areas compared with bees, although they will use hot areas. And of course, what's important for most nest sites is the proximity of forage. How far away do they have to venture in order to get the necessary pollen for young and also nectar for energy? In the case of the larger bees like Apis and Bombus, they may actually go more than 1 kilometre in order to get appropriate forage. But many of our smaller bees will fly less than 600 meters. In fact, in my garden, there are some bees that I don't think ever fly more than 1 meter away from where they're nesting. So provided there's sufficient forage and sufficient succession of forage in the area, they'll do very, very well. If they have to start moving further afield, then that's going to actually impact on their success in terms of gathering pollen and so on. There's also an element of nest guarding. I won't talk about that now, I should be honest. So we also have soil types. And this is interesting in urban areas because we're not just restricted to what the underlying subsoils are. People dump sand, people dump rubble, we create bee banks, we do all sorts of things to create different environments which are suitable for bees. And it's really exciting to see how quickly some of these niches can be reoccupied or occupied by bees, even temporarily. So it's always worth checking any dumps of spoil, etc., to see what's actually beginning to occupy that site and keep a record of what might be there. It may be transient, and it may be that this is just bees moving from one place to another by leaping from different sites to different sites, or it may be they can establish long-term existence in a particular area, which is really useful to know. And of course, that leads us on to this idea of phylopatry, which is the fact that many bees, when they occupy a particular site, particularly the mining bees, and in the case of some of the aerial nesters as well, they'll come back again and again. They won't go far from their original site. So aggregations of bees can actually become quite large, but also be quite vulnerable as a consequence to disturbance and poor management. So it's really important to know what's around and what's in your area when looking at particular aggregations of bees. This, by the way, is one of my favorites, Andrena hemorrhoa. There's the lovely orange tip to its abdomen, and this gorgeous bee. This one had just emerged actually in the spring. And these are bees that tend to hide away more. So you tend to find them nesting at the base of anthills and grasslands, or tucked away nearby trees in overhanging grassy areas. So a little bit more secretive perhaps than some other bees. They're often, all bees have Dufour's gland, which produces either a kind of sticky cellophane type material for sealing up nest cells, but also produce pheromones. And it's probably these pheromones that help bees to actually find where they've actually nested. And it's great fun to actually watch and sit around rather than, again, this is the contradiction with recording. I like to record, I like to see what's out there, but at the same time, I want to sit and watch to see what the bees are doing. And watching them and seeing how they interact with their environments and how they find their nest sites or find each other and interact with each other is a really interesting thing to do. You'll often see, for example, male bees will be lecking around bushes. They'll often land on a leaf and appear to wipe themselves against the leaf. They're marking, they're scent marking territory. And then what will happen is you'll see clouds of male bees flying from bush to bush around the particular areas, and they're coming back to these pheromone marked areas where females will also be attracted if they're ready to mate, for example. And they do a similar thing, producing these females, in this case, produce the pheromones that seem to actually help them to identify where their nests are. Equally, that tends to attract some of the kleptoparasitic bees, the bees that actually don't make their own nests but lay their eggs in the nests of other bees. They too can detect these pheromones and use those to actually find bee nests, to actually sneak in when the bee has gone, to lay an egg in there, hence the kleptoparasitism, stealing the pollen supplies of another bee's nest cell. So I think you're getting an idea of why recording is important and why I think we should, most of us, any of us who are interested in wildlife should be recording what we see. Apart from anything else, this distribution and mapping is probably the most obvious one. I'll come on to that in a moment. These days, phenology, looking at the emergence dates and the changes in the emergence dates is really important. We're seeing earlier and earlier emergence with some species, which are the phenological changes. Of course, that may well be linked to climate change, of course. It's also important in us understanding biodiversity. The more species we have, the more biodiversity environment, hopefully the richer and more resilient that environment is going to be. Equally, if we're going to think about habitat restoration, the popular aim these days, or rewilding, the more controversial approach, what are we going to be doing? What kind of species should we be introducing or trying to attract? What's likely to actually get into an area? What's nearby? What's going to move from one area to another? We need to know those things in order to understand how to manage our environments. Understanding pollination, I'm going to jump over those, but also looking at green space interventions. How can we actually see where to direct people to actually see what's around them, to get interested in what's there? It's kind of a little bit more of a selfish approach, I suppose, in that way, to get people engaged and involved. And of course, looking at colonizing and so-called invasive species as well, very important. Here's an example of why it's important to be recording, and this is taken from the National Biodiversity Network Atlas. Here we're looking at Caletes hederi, which is the ivy mining bee. Its expansion from first being discovered in 2002 to its expansion through 2000 to 2013 in the blue dots, and its explosion post 2014 to cover most of England, and now reaching up towards Scotland as well. There's a massive expansion, and by recording where these bees are, we can see what's been happening with these bees, and lots of discussion as to why this has happened. We can talk about that later, perhaps. And then we can look at temporal distributions by year, and these are the numbers of records from 2012 to 2022, first discovered in 2007 in the UK. And you can see there's a rapid expansion of these bees, but plateauing, or even reduction in number of records nationally. And of course, these bees will arise, they emerge in August, peaking in September, October, when ivy flowers, of course, are out. The males will be emerging first, and then later on the females using the ivy pollen to stock their nests, and then declining through October and November, right until the following year. Here in London, we started to look at some of the data that we have in iRecord, and that's what we have at the moment. We'll talk about records a bit later on. But we can see that from the early days from 2013, we start to see records increasing in London, which then reach a kind of stable sort of record throughout the year up until 2023 in terms of numbers of records, a slight peak in 2020. Of course, COVID may have had an impact on the number of records that we have. People either going out and looking, which they wouldn't have done before, or not, depending on which sort of area they're in. And we can also generate heat maps to show where in our London recording area, this is the LNHS recording area, where these bees are. And you can see that pretty much Caletes hederi likes nice sandy soil. Nice warm sandy soil, and of course in Surrey and the Surrey Heaths, that's pretty much where we'd see them. But also there are little hot spots, for example, around here, which you may not be surprised to know is where many of us record, also in the Lee Valley and running down into Epping Forest, and then certain little sort of hot spots around down in Rainham Marshes down here as well, down here. So again, we can see as a possible, as a question arising whether we're looking at recorder bias or a real distribution. What we wouldn't expect to see Colites hederi in centre of London, because really it's not really a very urban bee. Whereas in these more open areas with plenty of sandy soil or banks or loose clay soil, we are actually seeing these bees establishing themselves. So as a recorder, I've been playing around with new models to try and understand and model and map the way that bees are appearing in London. And we've been working with others to actually generate new types of interrogation machines, if you like, using a little bit of AI, to generate new maps. So this is for Colites hederi, but this is just in London. And you'll see in contrast to the national picture, where we've seen a decline in the number of records. Actually, records in the London area have been increasing, which fits with anecdotal evidence that we see more of these bees in the London area. So that's good. It's nice to see. It's kind of fitting with what we'd expect. Just to sort of try and normalize the data, it's worth looking at Apis mellifera, which is probably the most commonly recorded bee. And you can see that we have an interesting concentration of honeybees in central London, which becomes less as we move out of London. And I know that there are several in the audience that might want to comment on that later on. And we can see a similar massive increase or exponential rise or apparent exponential rise in records of honeybee. And again, it's difficult to know whether that's because we're seeing more recording, which I suspect is the case, and how that's superimposed on an actual increase in the, or potential increase in the number of honeybees actually present in our cities. And then just to kind of compare that, so Colites hederi is a late emerging bee. Here's one of our earliest emerging bees, which is Anthophora plumipes. And this has a very similar distribution to the honeybee, unlike the Colites hederi, which has an inverse distribution, being more common outside and less common inside. And again, we're seeing an increase in records and a slight decline this year, but I think there are still more records to come through. And again, anecdotally, there have been more of these bees being sighted across London. So this kind of fits with what we're seeing. So the records and the anecdotes seem to be going hand in hand, which is nice. It's not just observer bias, where there may be an element of that. We need to work on that later. So how do you get involved? How do you all get, you can see that I'm trying to encourage everybody to start recording, not just bees and other things as well, but bees in particular. And the focus has got to be iRecord. iRecord allows us to see what you're doing, how you're doing it, and also recognize the individuals who are doing the recording. Not because we want to spy on you or anything like that, but because we need to be able to make sure that the same people are actually reporting again and again, and we can be confident that they're getting it right. iNaturalist is also a useful tool, and iNaturalist records are now ported through to iRecord. I'm now a verifier for bees and wasps, or bees in iRecord. And so what I'm doing there is we'll often be looking at iNaturalist records as well. And there's an issue with the iNaturalist records in that if you have used a pseudonym, I'm not sure that we can actually use your record at the moment. So there's a bit of a discussion at the moment as to whether anonymous records can actually be used. We can discuss that again at the end if you'd like to. So iRecord is the preferred recording medium. Remember, with bees and wasps, there are no county recorders. We have BWAS, the Bees, Wasps and Ants Recording Society, who is the main organisation for taking those records on. My role in this is very much to collate some of the data and possibly do some preliminary cleaning before it goes off to BWAS. Then we have local recording schemes. So, for example, we have the Wren Wildlife and Conservation Group over in East London, which does systematic year-on-year recording and has been doing so for the last 50 years. Specific organisations like the Bumblebee Conservation Trust that will run transects for systematic recording, which is brilliant. These are, in any area, there will be these small groups that are set up to do local recording. And But at the moment, it'd be nice to actually start to link a lot of these together, because there's a tendency to be a little bit siloed across London, particularly from east to west. Then there are national schemes like the UK Pollinator Monitoring Scheme, or POMS, which encourages us to do flower insect time counts, to look at data giving us an idea of density, which is really good. They also run systematic surveys in 1K squares, but none of those, unfortunately, are currently in our recording area. So I'll skip over none of them in London, in fact. There are local record centres. Of course, for ours is Giggle, and we're working and hoping to do more work with Giggle to develop mapping projects and also targeting models as well, to find out where we should be looking for bees and wasps, and possibly other insects as well beyond there. And of course, recording your local aerial favourite spots, targeting an unrecorded area, looking in your gardens, looking as you're walking to work or walking from school or to the shops, and recording what's around and posting those in iRecord would be fantastic. A lot of those urban areas probably do have bees, but they're not being recorded. And I know from talking to others that often they'll go to a nature reserve or a recognised site where there will be bees and ignore everything in between. But it'd be fantastic. We can see some more records coming up in, solidly urban sites, particularly records of nest sites as well, nest aggregates. So you can do that as an ad hoc basis, or you can do a systematic survey. So you pick up areas that you'll visit, say 4 times a year, once in May, June, July, and August, just to see what's around, making sure it's a nice sunny day, nice and warm, no rain, and probably starting about 9 o'clock in the morning. That'd be great. If you don't know how to do iRecord, which I'm sure many of you do know how to use it, Kieran has produced some wonderful videos which are actually fantastic for helping you to understand how to use iRecord. And there's probably plenty of help, and I'm sure we can if you contact us, if you want to learn how to iRecord for bees and wasps, we can help you with that. Of course, you need to support your records with images, and this is one area that causes no end of consternation. Generally speaking, the images I see on iRecord for verification do tend to be either brilliant, okay, or not really useful, particularly where they're very blurred and out of focus and don't really show the details that are needed. So in order to actually improve any images to support records, you can have to use these rather cheap things. You can use a £12 clip-on macro lens, which work really, really well. They can be a bit clunky sometimes. You need to practice using them to get it right. And it depends on your phone type as to how well they work. You may need to buy or use an app to control the phone camera. But generally speaking, these will actually produce really good images. There are more expensive types you can buy, which give you a longer depth of, a focal distance. The trouble with these lenses, you have to get very close to the insect, and often bees, being strangely shy of people, tend to fly off at the earliest opportunity. So hence why I think a lot of people do end up with blurry images, which consist of an abdomen and blurred wings, as the bee flies away very quickly. Frustrating, yes, but often the bee will come back, so you can have another look at it later. Or you can get these other lenses which have a longer focal length, so you don't have to get quite so close to the bee, and then you can get a good photograph of it. Or you can go down the more expensive route and buy either bridge cameras or 4/3 cameras, which are quite light, with these really great f2.8 lenses. Both of these cameras will do focus stacking on the fly as well, if you can hold the camera steady enough to give you a really sharp image. You can also buy clip-on macro lenses, the Raynox lenses, which will also get you much closer with bigger magnification to see where the hairs are on where every surface structure on the abdomen or the thorax might be, that helps with identification. Then if you're very, very wealthy, and I'm definitely not, you can get full frame cameras, but they tend to be very heavy and clunky and need all sorts of other things. So, I mean, I know some people in the audience have used full frame cameras and get some excellent results, but you have to balance between recording and taking great photographs. There's a compromise between the two. And of course, developing field craft is really important too, which then raises the question, how many photographs do you need? What type of photographs? Again, it would be really helpful for us as verifiers if we see a range of images showing some of the features. Generally, you want a view of the top of the insect, the sides of the insect, which is really good, perhaps the face as well. And often taking pictures like this where you can see a broad swathe of the thorax. So as many faces or sides of the insect as possible. In this case, it's, let's say, if you're separating Vespula vulgaris, the common wasp, which is this one, from the German wasp Vespula germanica, where you can actually see this gap, the malar gap. You can see this, the depth of the black staining, coloring of the face. You can see the shape of these humeral stripes, shapes of these wing colors as well. So basically seeing all of the clues that help us to identify a particular wasp or bee. And again, very often you can't see these things in the living animal either. Once it's moving around rapidly foraging, freezing the bee or wasp with your camera and phone will help you to identify that bee or wasp in the field, which is brilliant. It's been such a game changer for all of us working in both natural history in general and field recording in particular. Then, of course, you can actually learn to ID bees. And again, a lot of you, I'm preaching to the converted, but we run the invertebrate study days with the LNHS, as Kieran was mentioning before, and we have the ID courses also run by both the LNHS and also the Biological Recording Company. Field Studies Council often offer some more expensive courses, but they're very good. Then there are various local wildlife trusts and other organisations that will run training days, particularly in bumblebees, less so with some of the other insects like solitary bees or wasps. You can also get independent lab sessions in particular institutions like the Natural History Museum or further afield in Oxford or in Reading if you're a member of BENS, the BNH British Entomological Natural History Society, which has a field studies centre. So there are various places you can go. And of course, to help you with identification, we had the Bee Wars, the Bees, Wasps and Ants Recording Society Facebook site, which is brilliant. You've got lots of experts out there that will help you with your IDs of your photographed insects. One thing I would say as a verifier is that if you are submitting a record that's been seen by one of the verifiers on the Facebook site, if you can post a link to that comment or agreement with your identification, that would be brilliant. That helps us to verify or re-verify, if you like, records that have come in. It's very useful. So getting to know bees. Bee walks, really popular, fantastic for kids as well as for adults. Getting up close and personal with bees in the wild and getting to know them. I find them really enjoyable, and I think most people do as well. So anybody in the audience who's been on my bee walks will either agree or disagree, I don't know. But I find them really useful, and it's a great way of engaging the public, and not just with bees and wasps, but with wild and natural history issues as well. There's a lot of discussion that can occur with that. And of course, being able to catch bees and actually show them to individuals is a fantastic thing to be able to do. And then they can take their own photographs as well. So it's great. We can also run bioblitzes, whereby we get a large number of different people coming in to take records from different species and collating those together. Again, that gives fantastic opportunities for integrating identification and recognition of different species in an assemblage. In this case, for example, in a graveyard. And then we have, I call it semi-systematic survey. Systematic surveys of transects with bees and wasps tend to be tricky because most bees and wasps fly away as soon as you come anywhere near them. So it's kind of a bit like butterflies, walk and stop, and you'll walk and stop and there'll be nothing to see because they've gone to ground. So they tend to be a bit more ad hoc, and we're just looking to see what's there, but we'll have a walking route that we'll actually establish. In this case, this was a session where we set out in the hope of finding Melanus arvensis, not a particularly rare wasp, sometimes difficult to find. This is a so-called fly wolf, and we were able to find just in the nest, just underneath this tree, was actually a nest site consisting of these wonderful wasps. And here I got distracted by the fact there was a fly prey to being dropped by this particular wasp. So again, recording can often sort of be slightly diverted by interesting things and behaviors that happen, which can often mean that you don't get very far. It's this classic thing of walking out with the intention of doing a 100, 200, 300 meter walk and only doing 5 meters before you get distracted by something and don't move on. not good for systematic surveys, I have to add. What happens to records? So basically, we are looking at a data lifecycle. I took this from the Giggle slide just by way of demonstration. We have data collection, you putting your data into iRecord. We have a validation process to check that actually the dates, the location are correct. And then a verification process to make sure that the bee or wasp has been identified correctly. Then there's an aggregation and curation methodology, which the moment through iRecord goes through to BWAS, who will actually do that, and then generate the storage of the records that have gone through. Now, these hopefully will then go through to our local records center, which in our case is Giggle, and then we can start to analyze and use that data. This process is actually being quite delayed and quite slow. So some of you have noticed there's a small backlog of verifications for bees and wasps, but we are working in the London area to try and move that on. But hopefully watch this space, because I think things are really moving with how we're going to make use of the data that you're giving to us. So the more data we get, the more effective we can be with that. So I'm lost the time. I think coming to an end now, but I'm just going to talk a little bit about habitats and looking at habitats, and in particular a thing about that I have, which is looking at anthropogenic sites and the way that people influence the environment. So we have the usual sort of banks and the slightly poached banks, in this case an eroded bank, which is fantastic for bees and wasps. It's a south-facing area. It's actually in a Hadley Park. But also we have this area. This used to be, back here, a cycle track used for mountain bikers. And some of the children have decided to go off the bank and jump over to the bank below it. What they've done is created a poached area underneath. And this is one of the richest sites I found in this particular area. So there were more insects burrowing in and using this site than there were in this kind of naturally eroding site, which is quite close by. So people poaching and damaging sites, inverted commas, creating bare space, taking the undergrowth away, provide fantastic other edges, which is where a lot of insects like to be, where they want to rest and so on, and also nest sites in terms of bare, warm earth for mining bees. And there's another example here. So this is actually in Hollow Ponds and Leighton Flats. And this is interesting because this is a bank that's often used by people picnicking up on the top here, looking over the pond. And at one point, this entire area was one bare bank and absolutely full of bees throughout the year, and also wasps like Oxybelus. At some point in time, the overhanging branch has sagged. As a consequence, people don't sit underneath it, and you can see you're getting the regrowth underneath it. And what's happening is that the bee populations that were here are now shaded and being out-competed by the grass, and they're all moving over. So we've got a denser concentration over here of nest sites, but not so much going on over in this area. So you can see how quickly bees and wasps will actually adapt to changes in their environments. And of course, the standing wood is so important. And this is Nurse's White Webs in Enfield. This is a fantastic old tree, which is full of Osmia bicornis when we visited it. And this is an example of very important and increasingly rare kind of nesting environment, which is under threat. And it's under threat because of the needs of certain football clubs to develop training grounds. So they're going to try and buy up this area and convert it into AstroTurf and other things, but removing and threatening this fantastic environment for a wide variety of both vertebrates and invertebrates. And of course, it's interesting that it's an old golf course. And old golf courses have proved themselves to be interesting sites. We have several in East London that have been gone out of use, but they contain sand bunkers, and the sand bunkers turn out to be absolutely ideal sites for a number of insects like Andrena babilabris, for example, the Oxybelus wasp, as nest sites. They really are important and useful sites, both for insects, but also for people to actually move and engage with the environment around them, rather than being excluded by inappropriate development from a natural history point of view. Another thing that's really fantastic to work with has been graveyards and cemeteries, which sounds a bit strange, really, in a respectful way, of course. But many of these are now being developed into urban nature reserves. although they may still be used as burial grounds and people may still visit them to visit relatives, there is still a way of actually making these sites, because they're relatively undisturbed, particularly older graveyards may not have been ploughed for many years. They may contain relic species of both plants and insects, which are really interesting, and they form sort of islands of activity which can be linked together to form corridors between many areas, urban spaces. And an example of that, those linkages might be, for example, this was some planting done by a neighbour of mine, where they created this fantastic pollinators corridor, which worked for 3 or 4 years really, really well, linking beyond these houses. There is actually massive, all the gardens face inwards, so huge numbers of bees and wasps nesting in that area. And then further down towards where I've taken the picture from, there are more areas, and there are bees flying backwards and forwards along this corridor all the time during the spring and summer. It's fantastic, it really is. And it doesn't take much effort to do it, particularly when you've got the support from the local council, who are also putting in bee-friendly streets. Then you get these things that pop up as if from nowhere. And I discovered this locally as well. And here you have an enclosure, not quite sure where it came from, who did it. Nobody really seemed to know when I asked, but it's full of sand and subsoil, recently planted, and was actually full of Anthidium manicatum fighting it out over the few lamb's ears that were there. This is relatively new, so I'm looking forward to going back to see what bees have actually started or may start to nest in this substratum. The Anthidium, of course, being a crevice nester, it's not going to nest in the ground. Then, of course, you have deliberate attempts to encourage bees and wasps into an environment. This is fantastic work that's been done by John Little and his company, and also Russell Miller and his groups over in Hackney Marshes, creating bee posts which are appropriate. They're actually going to, we know from work that's been done by John Little and also Benny Hawksby, that these will actually attract bees and work really, really well for success, but also generating spaces that can be used by a variety of different bees and wasps, maybe other insects as well. Taking out a car parking space to create a small micro reserve is an absolutely brilliant idea. And again, very accessible for people who want to come and have a look at it, which is another important issue with a lot of our recording. Bycatch for recording, of course, are the most exciting things to look at. These are the parasites, the kleptoparasites and parasitoids that are found amongst bees. Always worth looking at, always exciting to see. So, for example, you have Sapiga quinquipunctata, which is a wasp that will actually lay its eggs in the nests of aerial nesters. We have the nemada bees, which do the same thing for ground nesting bees. Then we have the canopid flies, which tend to go for either bumblebees or some of the andrinas. They'd ambush these bees in flight, insert an egg into them, and then the parasitoid larva will grow within that bee, zombifying it in the process. Always a great one for the kids if you're trying to tell them how it's quite gruesome. That really gets their attention. Then, of course, you get all the satellite flies, the anthermide flies, often with these wonderful silvery headlights as they fly around the nest sites. Worth watching out for these when you're looking at a ground nest, to see what insects are around, what are following there, and seeing what's actually going on. And watch to see how the bees try and avoid them. They'll take different flight paths to try and avoid the parasites and kleptoparasites, to throw them off the scent, as it were. Also, you'll see there's another anthermide, which will actually trail and follow wasps. And often you'll see these small solitary wasps, like Ancestrocerus, flying from flower to flower or hunting. And it'll be followed, particularly only the females, will be followed by a fly. And every time the wasp stops, the fly stops. The wasp moves off, the fly follows. And I've seen them sort of flying, and then just the wasp will catch its prey, whether it's a bug or a small caterpillar, pick it up and fly off with it with the fly in tow. The fly is following that wasp to its hidden nest site. Fantastic stuff to watch. It's so exciting when you see it. Fiendishly difficult to photograph or film, though. Then the other thing to look out for, which is important for all of us recorders, is what are the colonizers? What are the next bees that are going to be occupying London's urban scene? We've already seen an increase in Osmia cornuta, the European orchard bee, which is fantastic. They're lovely bees to see. Where they've come from and why, it's interesting actually. When I looked at the records, the original records were from the southeast of London, but more recent records are more from north and west. So whether that's a recording bias or a change in distribution, I'm not sure. It'd be interesting if anybody's got any views on that. We have Polistes, the paper wasps, which keep appearing on a regular basis, and it's only a matter of time before I suspect they fully establish themselves. And then we have Isodontia mexicana, this thread wasp, which is one of these wonderful wasps that carries grass, one of the grass-carrying wasps that's appeared in various parts of London as well. There are other bees particular to look out for and very small wasps, but they are fiendishly difficult to separate out. So always look carefully at your bees and wasps. You never know what you might be seeing. An elephant in the room, of course, is Vespa velutina, or the Asian hornet. I won't say too much about that, other than, yes, there have been 2 nests located and destroyed in the London area. And yes, they do need to be reported if they're seen to the non-native species secretariat. But do report them to us as well, because there aren't that many records on iRecord. But these are, I think there's a lot of discussion to be had about these. I think the general consensus is these wasps are here, or hornets are here to stay. It's just a matter of time before they start to become more regularly seen. I don't think we can keep them back. We can slow down the spread. And it's a question, particularly for beekeepers, to change perhaps their beekeeping practice to try and mitigate the risk of loss. The problem with trying to kill off this particular hornet is the bycatch, particularly for our own European hornet, has been quite horrendous, and we don't really want that. So finally, we have some WhatsApp groups that we set up. We have the Bee Survey group, which is a small group, a very diverse group of people with different skills and expertise that we're using to develop surveys and surveying and recording in the London area. And also it's very much a special interest group. For those of you who want to know more about what we do, we have a Bee and Wasp events WhatsApp group, which if you want to contact me at bees@lnhs.org.uk, if you're interested, we can put you on that so you can know what's going on. Sometimes something will crop up, there'll be something cited, or there'll be an opportunity to go and look at a particular site, and it's good to actually get people know quickly, hence the WhatsApp rather than a Facebook group. And then finally, some acknowledgements. So this is our Bee Survey group at the moment as it stands, who've been doing lots of excellent work and been very supportive and keeping the recording going in the London area. And also to Dr. Madgwick, who helped design and build the data analysis. And that's work in progress at the moment. So thank you very much for your attention. It's a bit of a, I think that the kind of import of this is think about habitats, think about recording, get involved. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tony, for absolutely brilliant. Just because of timing, I think we're going to have to.
Yeah, I realised I was going over time. I couldn't stop myself. Sorry about that.
No, it's fine. I'm just going to go through a couple of the questions and explain, because they've been answered in the chat a bit. So, and sometimes you've asked them a little bit, you've answered them later on in the talk. So somebody asked about recommended any phone apps. You talked about iRecord, etc. There was also questions about if you don't have a phone, and we said in the chat that iRecord is actually predominantly a website. There's apps that feed into to a computer. Something I also want to say to anybody recording in London, if you're having trouble with record submission, then come along to one of our Eventbrite study days. So it's not just about helping people with ID, we can help with submitting records as well. Right, okay, there was a question about the impact of honeybees on native pollinators. So for that, I'm going to refer people to a talk by Mark Patson called The London Bee Situation, where he covers that in a lot more detail, because there is a potentially a significant impact, particularly in urban environment.
Absolutely.
So I want to reserve a question for you that's relevant for this talk. So, right, I'm going to do 2 questions, that's all. And Tony, I'm going to ask you to try and answer them concisely.
Okay, go on then.
How are bee bricks in terms of providing habitat?
Okay. Is it being recorded?
It is being recorded. You can be
I personally,
quickly.
I think they're useless. I do not recommend them. They are fantastic decorative inserts into a wall, and as Ed Milner probably knows, they are superb for spiders. The holes are not deep enough. We think there's an issue with condensation as well. The smaller holes are not actually drilled through, so it's kind of, yeah, it doesn't work. Having said that, there is a study that was done in France with a very similar kind of structure, but not as bee bricks, but as a concrete structure with a different type of concrete, which was actually very successful. But I've not the occupancy rate of bee bricks published by the company and sponsored by the company is less than 5%. So you're far better off using other type. Please don't buy some of these commercial bee hotels and so on. You're better off looking online at some of the ones you can make yourself that are smaller and they can be distributed around, rather than having these big massive things which are basically bee slums, which are not worth having.
It's a bit more rewarding if you've made it yourself and they come as well, isn't it? So.
It is. It shows that you've done something good, and also making sure that these are things that are going to break down. I think there's a lot of debate about whether you should clean out bee hotels or not, and so on. I'm of the view not, because generally speaking, bees will stop using them once they start to build up parasites and mites. Those will then die off, and then they'll start using them again. So you see cycles of use and disuse, which is exactly what you see in the wild. If you think about dead trees standing, they're not getting cleaned out, but the bees will clean them out themselves. So they're fine. There's another question.
Right, yeah. Final question, one from Maria. Maria said, you've suggested some management interventions are quite unhelpful, such as the cutting and removal or burning of bramble. Are there other things that are particularly problematic, and are there conflicts with managing habitats appropriately for other taxonomic groups?
I think that's absolutely right. It's interesting, Ed, talking about Tower Hamlets Cemetery. I haven't seen the cutting that's gone on there, because of course, if you're trying to promote bees, it's quite, you need to cut the grass back because they don't like it so much. So you can, it's with most of these things, if you're going to have big interventions, it's probably better doing a mosaic. And I think Tajinder's actually we were talking about this the other day with Claybury Park as to how you manage grass areas where you want to scrape the surface to revert to acid grassland, which promotes, in this case, meadow ants as well as bees. But at the same time, you can't strip out everything because you don't know what's there in the first place. So again, good recording is required to know what's there, and then thinking very carefully about mosaic management. Having said that, my expertise is not in land management and habitat management. In fact, in the audience, there are some much more skilled individuals than that. But that's what's so important, is bringing people with expertise together that's required. No one person, I think, in this day and age can actually be an advisor on large habitat management. You need concerted, integrated approach to make planning work properly.
All right, maybe we'll sneak one more question in.
Go on then.
So Lynn has asked, how do bees that nest on disturbed sandy ground cope with trampling, holes collapsing, etc.? Because it's interesting when you say it's particularly, I mean, that area with the BMX stuff, that's going to be particularly compacted with kids like launching their bikes into the ground, etc. So yeah, how do the bees cope with that?
There is no hard evidence, because nobody's done it as far as I'm aware. The anecdotal or the empirical evidence is the fact these bees populations survive year after year after year. They never disappear. So no matter how wet or damaged that ground becomes, there are still bees there. And that's,
we don't know how they cope, but they do.
They do. I mean, for a lot of them, they go quite deep, so they're not affected. Most of them will actually they'll have seals around the nest cells, so that'll protect them as well. There was an interesting comment that's made, I'm terribly sorry, I've forgotten his name, Coalhouse Fort, where we were talking about Caletes holophilus, which is the sea aster mining bee, and they nest right on the tide line. So in high tides, when storms, their nests can actually get washed away. but they're cellophane bees, so the actual nest tubes are actually still held on. They just sort of hang around. So as the subsoil moves away from them, the nest cells survive. So if it's in the right time of year, they would survive that. Some amazing coping strategies. But in terms of trampling, as I say, particularly where you've got hard-packed earth, once the bees and wasps are buried into it, it's particularly resilient. If you look at Cercis ribiensis, which is the bee wolf, not bee wolf, bee fox, that's the common name, they only seem to nest in hard-packed pathways, and their nests survive people walking over them all the time, and they don't seem to collapse. So they're obviously very good engineers.
All right, well, thank you very much, Tony.